The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Manor like secrets waiting to be revealed. Thomas Hartwell had served as head of security for the Pemberton family for nearly 2 decades, and in all that time, he had never witnessed anything quite like what unfolded on that crisp October morning. The grand estate, nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside, had been home to the Pemberton noble lineage for over 3 centuries. Lord Edmund Pemberton had married twice, first to the beloved Lady Margaret, who had passed away 5 years prior, and then to the controversial Lady Vivienne, a woman whose sharp tongue and calculating nature had never quite won over the household staff or the local community. Thomas was making his usual rounds through the East Wing corridors when he heard voices coming from the blue drawing room. The door was slightly ajar, and though he would normally pass by without a second thought, something in the tone made him pause. Lady Vivienne's voice carried that particular edge that usually meant trouble was brewing. "Those children are nothing but a burden," Lady Vivienne was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. "Little Emma and James, always underfoot, always demanding attention, and Catherine does nothing but coddle them. It's pathetic, really." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Lady Catherine was Lord Edmund's daughter from his first marriage, a gentle soul who had married young Lord Henry Ashworth 2 years prior. Her children, 7-year-old Emma and 5-year-old James, were the light of the manor, beloved by staff and visitors alike for their cheerful dispositions and innocent curiosity about the world around them. "I've heard they're having difficulties in their lessons," continued Lady Vivienne to her companion. "Mrs. Blackwood, her personal secretary and closest confidant. The tutor mentioned that James struggles with his letters and Emma is far too emotional during mathematics. Frankly, I think it's a reflection of poor breeding. Catherine was always too soft, just like her mother." Thomas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Lady Margaret had been universally adored by her husband, her daughter, the staff, and the entire county. To hear her memory tarnished in such a way made his blood boil, but years of professional training kept him rooted to his spot, listening despite himself. "What does Lord Edmund think?" Mrs. Blackwood asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Edmund is blind to their faults naturally. He sees his precious grandchildren through rose-colored glasses. But mark my words, those children will never amount to anything significant. They lack the proper discipline, the backbone required for our station in life." Emma cries at the smallest criticism, and James can barely string together a coherent sentence when nervous. The cruelty in Lady Vivienne's voice was unmistakable. Thomas had watched those children grow from infants into bright, curious youngsters. Emma had a natural talent for music and could play simple melodies on the piano that brought tears to her grandfather's eyes. James, though shy, had a remarkable memory for stories and could recite entire fairy tales word for word after hearing them, just once. "Perhaps it would be better if they spent less time here at the manor," Lady Vivienne mused, her tone suggesting this was not the first time she had considered this possibility. "Catherine and Henry have their own estate, after all. There's really no need for the children to be here so frequently, disrupting the household routine." Thomas knew that Lord Edmund treasured his time with his grandchildren. After Lady Margaret's death, Emma and James had become his primary source of joy. The old lord would spend hours in the garden with them, teaching them about the different plants and flowers, or in the library reading them stories from the same books he had once read to their mother.
"I'll speak to Catherine about it," Lady Vivienne continued.
"Perhaps suggest that the children need more structure in their own home environment. I'm sure I can phrase it in a way that seems reasonable, even caring." Mrs. Blackwood made a small sound of agreement. "You always know exactly what to say, my lady. It's all about presentation, Eleanor. People hear what they want to hear, especially when it comes from someone in authority. Catherine is so eager to please and so unsure of herself as a mother. A few well-placed suggestions about what's best for the children, and she'll convince herself it was her idea." Thomas felt sick to his stomach. He had watched Lady Catherine struggle with confidence since her mother's death and her father's remarriage. She often seemed lost in her childhood home, unsure of her place now that Lady Vivienne had assumed the role of Lady of the Manor. The young woman clearly adored her children but was constantly second-guessing herself, seeking approval and reassurance from others about her parenting choices. "And if Lord Edmund objects?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. Lady Vivienne's laugh was cold and calculating. Edmund won't object if he believes it's what Catherine wants. And why would he question his daughter's judgment about her own children? Besides, with them gone more often, this house can finally return to the dignity and order it deserves. No more sticky fingerprints on the furniture. No more childish laughter echoing through the halls at inappropriate hours. No more toys scattered about the formal rooms. Thomas remembered the joy that had returned to Ravenshollow Manor when Emma and James began visiting regularly. After Lady Margaret's death, the house had felt like a tomb, silent, cold, and devoid of life. The children's presence had breathed warmth back into these ancient walls. Their grandfather had emerged from his grief, finding purpose again in their care and education. "I must say, my lady, your approach is quite clever," Mrs. Blackwood commented. "No one could accuse you of being unkind to the children. You're simply looking out for their best interests." "Exactly. And in truth, they would probably be happier in their own familiar environment. Children that age need routine and consistency, not the chaos of dividing their time between two households. It's really quite selfish of Catherine to use this place as a convenient nursery while she and Henry attend to their social obligations." This last comment was particularly galling to Thomas, who knew that Lady Catherine brought the children to Ravenshollow primarily because her father had specifically requested it. Lord Edmund had made it clear that he wanted to be actively involved in his grandchildren's upbringing, especially after losing so many years with his own daughter following his wife's death. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Lady Vivian outlining her strategy for gradually reducing the children's presence at the manor. She spoke of questioning their behavior in front of their mother, highlighting their minor mistakes and shortcomings, and suggesting that perhaps they would benefit from more disciplined instruction elsewhere. Thomas had heard enough. As quietly as he had arrived, he slipped away from the door and continued down the corridor, his mind racing. In his 20 years of service to the Pemberton family, he had never faced such a moral dilemma. His duty was to protect the family, but which family members deserved his protection? Lord Edmund trusted his wife, believing her to be a stabilizing force in his life after the devastation of losing Lady Margaret. He had no idea that the woman sharing his bed and his table harbored such contempt for his beloved grandchildren. Lady Catherine already struggled with confidence and self-doubt. If Lady Vivian succeeded in her manipulation, it would likely drive an irreparable wedge between the young mother and her father. But perhaps most importantly, Emma and James were innocent children who deserved to feel loved and welcome in their grandfather's home. They had already lost one grandmother to death. Now they risked losing their connection to their surviving family through calculated cruelty. Thomas made his way to his small office in the staff quarters, where he sat heavily in his chair and stared out the window at the gardens where he had so often seen Lord Edmund playing with his grandchildren. The weight of what he had overheard pressed down on him like a physical burden. He thought about his own childhood, growing up as the son of a groundskeeper on a similar estate. He remembered the sting of dismissive comments from those who considered themselves his betters, the way casual cruelty could shape a child's entire sense of self-worth. Emma and James were too young to fully understand adult politics and manipulation, but they would certainly feel the effects of being unwelcome in a place they had considered a second home. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when Thomas finally rose from his chair, his decision made. He could not stand by and watch innocent children be hurt by adult scheming, regardless of the potential consequences to his own position. The question was not whether to act, but how to act in a way that would truly protect those who needed protection most. As he walked through the manor's corridors one final time that evening, Thomas nodded to the other staff members going about their duties. None of them knew what he had overheard, but he suspected that some had noticed the subtle changes in Lady Vivian's behavior toward the children over recent months. Perhaps he was not the only one who had observed her lack of warmth toward Emma and James, or her tendency to find fault with their perfectly normal childhood behavior. The path forward would require careful consideration and strategic thinking. Thomas had not risen to his position by being impulsive or careless. Whatever action he took would need to be measured, effective, and designed to protect the innocent without causing unnecessary harm to others. But one thing was certain. He could not allow Lady Vivian's cruel intentions to go unchallenged. The evening shadows grew longer as Thomas returned to his quarters, already formulating a plan that would change the course of events at Ravenshollow Manor forever. The children's laughter still echoed in his memory, and he was determined to ensure that it would continue to fill these halls for years to come. Thomas spent the next 3 days carefully observing the dynamics within Raven's Hollow Manor, paying particular attention to the interactions between family members and staff. What he discovered only confirmed his worst fears about Lady Vivian's intentions and her growing influence over the household atmosphere. On Wednesday morning, he watched from the servants' staircase as Lady Vivian encountered 7-year-old Emma in the main hallway. The little girl was carrying her favorite doll, a beautiful porcelain figure that had belonged to her late grandmother, Lady Margaret. Emma was humming softly to herself, lost in the innocent world of childhood imagination. "Emma, dear," Lady Vivian called out, her voice carrying that false sweetness Thomas had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "What are you doing wandering the halls with that old thing?" Emma stopped immediately, clutching her doll closer to her chest. "I was going to the morning room to wait for Mama. She said we would have tea together." "How lovely," Lady Vivian replied, though her smile never reached her eyes. "But don't you think you're getting rather old for dolls? Most girls your age are learning proper accomplishments, needlework, languages, deportment. Playing with toys is really more appropriate for much younger children." Thomas saw Emma's face fall, confusion and hurt flickering across her delicate features. "But grandfather said grandmother used to play with this doll when she was little. He told me stories about it." "Yes, well, your grandfather tells many stories," Lady Vivian said dismissively. "The past is the past, Emma. What matters is preparing yourself for the future. Perhaps we should speak to your mother about enrolling you in more structured activities. Children need discipline and purpose, not endless hours of frivolous play." Emma's lower lip began to tremble, but she nodded obediently. "Yes, ma'am. Run along now and do try to walk more quietly. This is a manor house, not a playground." Thomas watched as the little girl hurried away, her earlier joy completely extinguished. He made a mental note of the interaction, adding it to the growing list of similar incidents he had witnessed over the past few days. Later that afternoon, he observed a similar scene involving 5-year-old James. The boy had been in the library with his grandfather, looking at picture books and practicing his letters. Lord Edmund had stepped away briefly to speak with the butler about dinner arrangements, leaving James alone at the large oak table. Lady Vivian entered the library, presumably to fetch a book, and found James struggling to write the letter R on his slate. The boy was concentrating intensely, his tongue poking out slightly in determination. "James," Lady Vivian said, approaching the table, "what is this mess?" James looked up eagerly, hoping for encouragement. "I'm practicing my letters, Aunt Vivian. Grandfather is helping me learn to write my name." Lady Vivian picked up the slate and examined it with obvious disapproval. "This is barely legible. Most children your age can write much more clearly. Are you certain you're applying yourself properly?" The boy's face crumpled slightly. "I'm trying very hard. Grandfather says I'm improving." "Your grandfather is very kind, but kindness doesn't prepare children for the real world. If you cannot master something as simple as basic penmanship, how do you expect to succeed in more complex subjects? Perhaps your parents need to consider hiring a more demanding tutor, someone who will push you to achieve proper standards." James stared down at his slate, his small shoulders sagging with disappointment. "I thought I was doing better." "Well, thinking something and actually achieving it are two very different things. You must learn to be honest with yourself about your limitations, James. False praise helps no one." Thomas had to force himself to remain hidden as he watched the interaction unfold. Lord Edmund returned to the library moments later, his face immediately brightening when he saw his grandson. "How are those letters coming along, my boy?" the older man asked warmly. James hesitated, glancing between his grandfather and Lady Vivian. "Maybe not so good, grandfather. Aunt Vivienne says most children write better than me." Lord Edmund's expression shifted to confusion as he looked at the slate. "Nonsense! This is excellent work for a 5-year-old. Look at how much improvement you've made just this week." He turned to his wife with a puzzled smile. "Surely you can see the progress he's making, my dear?" Lady Vivian smiled back, but Thomas could see the calculation behind her eyes. "Of course, Edmund. I simply want to ensure James reaches his full potential. Perhaps I was being overly critical. But the damage had already been done. James spent the remainder of the lesson second-guessing himself, asking repeatedly if his letters were good enough and apologizing for his efforts. The confident, eager little boy who had entered the library was replaced by an anxious child seeking constant validation. That evening, Thomas made his decision about how to proceed. He could not directly confront Lady Vivienne. His position in the household hierarchy made such an action impossible and potentially counterproductive. Nor could he approach Lord Edmund directly without concrete proof of his wife's manipulative behavior. The older man was deeply lonely since his first wife's death, and desperately wanted his second marriage to bring stability and happiness to his life. Instead, Thomas decided to focus on documentation and strategic intervention. He began keeping a detailed journal of Lady Vivienne's interactions with the children, recording dates, times, specific comments, and the children's reactions. He also started paying closer attention to her conversations with Lady Catherine, looking for evidence of the manipulation he had overheard being discussed. The opportunity for his first intervention came on Friday afternoon. Lady Catherine had arrived for what was supposed to be a pleasant family luncheon, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders as she spoke with Lady Vivienne in the small sitting room. "I'm concerned about the children's behavior lately," Lady Vivienne was saying as Thomas passed by the partially open door while conducting his security rounds. "Emma seems rather emotional, and James appears to lack confidence in his abilities. Perhaps the transition between two households is proving more difficult than we realized." Lady Catherine's voice was filled with worry. "Do you really think so? They seemed fine at home, but I have noticed they've been quieter after our visits here. I wondered if I was imagining things." "Oh, my dear, you're such an attentive mother. It's natural that you would notice these subtle changes. Children are remarkably adaptable, but they do need consistency and routine to truly thrive. The constant back and forth between Ravens Hollow and your estate might be creating more stress than we realized." Thomas could hear the seeds of doubt being planted in Lady Catherine's mind, exactly as Lady Vivienne had planned. This was his moment to act, but he needed to be subtle and strategic. He knocked gently on the doorframe and stepped into view. "Pardon the interruption, Lady Vivienne, Lady Catherine. I wanted to inform you that Lord Edmund is looking for the children in the garden. Young James found what he believes to be a robin's nest, and he's quite excited to show it to his grandfather and sister." Lady Catherine's face immediately brightened. "How wonderful! James has been fascinated by birds lately. Just yesterday he spent an hour watching the sparrows in our garden at home." "Indeed," Thomas continued, choosing his words carefully. "The children seem particularly comfortable and confident when they're exploring the grounds here at Ravens Hollow." Master James was explaining to the gardener's apprentice all about different bird species, quite impressive knowledge for a child his age, and Miss Emma has been teaching some of the younger staff children a new song she learned. They both seem very much at home here. He could see Lady Vivienne's expression tighten slightly at his comments, but she maintained her pleasant facade. "How lovely that they enjoy the outdoors. Shall I escort you to the garden?" Thomas offered. The children were most insistent that their mother come see their discovery. As they walked toward the garden, Thomas continued to casually mention positive observations about the children's behavior and interactions at the manor. He spoke of Emma's kindness toward the kitchen cat, James's polite greetings to all the staff members, and both children's obvious love for their grandfather. When they reached the garden, the scene that greeted them was exactly what Thomas had hoped for. Lord Edmund was kneeling beside a rose bush with both children, carefully examining a small nest nestled in the branches. James was pointing excitedly and explaining what he had observed about the bird's behavior, while Emma was gently holding her grandfather's hand and asking thoughtful questions about how the baby birds would learn to fly. "Mama," Emma called out, running toward her mother with arms outstretched. "Come see, there are 3 little eggs, and grandfather says they'll hatch in about 2 weeks. James joined them, bubbling over with enthusiasm. And I saw the mama bird bringing twigs this morning. She's making the nest bigger and softer for the babies." Lady Catherine gathered both children in her arms, her earlier worries temporarily forgotten in the face of their obvious happiness and excitement. Lord Edmund approached with a warm smile, clearly delighted by his grandchildren's curiosity and enthusiasm. "These 2 have been my best gardening assistants today," he said, ruffling James's hair affectionately. "Emma helped me identify 3 different types of flowers, and James spotted no fewer than 7 different bird species. We'll make naturalists of them yet." Thomas watched Lady Vivian carefully during this exchange. Her smile remained fixed in place, but he could see the frustration in her eyes as she witnessed the obvious bond between Lord Edmund and his grandchildren. This was not the scene of disruptive, poorly behaved children that she had been painting for Lady Catherine. "They do seem very engaged with nature," Lady Catherine observed, her voice thoughtful. "Perhaps we should consider adding natural history to their formal lessons." "An excellent idea," Lord Edmund agreed enthusiastically. "There's so much to learn from direct observation and experience. These grounds have been teaching children for generations. My grandfather taught me about birds and plants in this very garden." As the family continued their outdoor exploration, Thomas excused himself and returned to his duties, satisfied that his subtle intervention had been successful. By highlighting the children's positive behavior and natural curiosity, he had provided Lady Catherine with evidence that contradicted Lady Vivian's narrative of problematic, unstable children, who might be better served by less time at the manor. Over the following days, Thomas implemented similar small interventions, arranging for Lady Catherine to witness moments of her children's happiness and confidence at Raven's Hollow, ensuring that positive reports about their behavior reached her ears, and subtly countering Lady Vivian's attempts to plant seeds of doubt about the children's well-being. He also began building alliances among the staff, carefully mentioning his observations to trusted colleagues who had known the family for years. Artford, the head housekeeper who had served under Lady Margaret, proved particularly receptive to his concerns. "I've noticed the change in atmosphere myself," she confided during one of their conversations. "Those children were like sunshine after the dark months following Lady Margaret's passing. It troubles me to see them becoming hesitant and withdrawn." Thomas knew he was walking a dangerous line. If Lady Vivian discovered his interference, his position would be at risk. But as he watched Emma and James gradually becoming more subdued and anxious during their visits to what had once been their haven, he knew that his professional security extended beyond protecting the family's physical safety. It meant protecting them from all forms of harm, including emotional manipulation and psychological cruelty. The real test of his strategy would come in the days ahead, as Lady Vivian undoubtedly intensified her efforts to distance the children from their grandfather. Thomas was prepared for that challenge, but he also knew that he would eventually need to take more direct action to fully protect the children and preserve the family bonds that Lady Vivian was working so methodically to destroy. The following week brought an unexpected development that forced Thomas to reconsider his careful, gradual approach. Lady Vivian, perhaps sensing that her subtle manipulations were not achieving the desired results quickly enough, decided to escalate her campaign against the children's presence at Raven's Hollow Manor. It began on Monday morning when Thomas noticed unusual activity in Lady Vivian's private sitting room. Mrs. Blackwood had been coming and going with increasing frequency, carrying correspondence and speaking in hushed tones with her employer. By Tuesday afternoon, the reason for this flurry of secretive activity became clear. Thomas was conducting his routine security check of the main entrance hall when he overheard Lady Vivian speaking with Dr. Pemberton, a distant cousin of Lord Edmund's, who served as the family physician. Dr. Pemberton was an elderly gentleman of stern disposition who had been practicing medicine for over 40 years and was known for his traditional views on child-rearing and discipline. "I appreciate you taking the time to visit, Doctor," Lady Vivian was saying as they stood near the grand staircase. "I wanted to discuss some concerns I've been having about Lord Edmund's grandchildren." Dr. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles and nodded gravely. "Of course, Lady Vivian. You mentioned in your letter that there were behavioral issues?" "I'm afraid so. Both children have been displaying signs of emotional instability and developmental delays that concern me greatly. Emma becomes hysterical at the slightest correction, and James seems unable to concentrate on even the most basic educational tasks. I worry that the lack of proper structure in their daily routine may be causing lasting harm." Thomas felt his jaw tighten as he listened to this complete distortion of the children's normal, healthy behavior. Emma was sensitive, like most children her age, but hardly hysterical. James was naturally quiet and thoughtful, not lacking in concentration. "Have you observed these behaviors yourself, Doctor?" Lady Vivian continued. "I thought perhaps a professional assessment might be beneficial, both for the children's sake and to help their parents understand the seriousness of the situation. I have not had recent opportunity to observe the children closely," Dr. Pemberton admitted. "However, If you believe there are concerns about their development and emotional regulation, it would indeed be prudent to conduct a proper evaluation. Thomas realized with growing alarm that Lady Vivienne was orchestrating a professional assessment designed to support her narrative that the children were problematic and would benefit from reduced time at the manor. Dr. Wemmons. Pemberton, while well-meaning, had not spent time with Emma and James recently and would be relying primarily on Lady Vivienne's account of their behavior. "I was thinking," Lady Vivienne said, her tone carefully measured, "that it might be best to conduct this evaluation here at the manor, in a familiar environment where the children's true behavioral patterns would be most apparent, perhaps during their next extended visit." "A reasonable approach," Dr. Pemberton agreed. Children often mask difficulties when they are in unfamiliar settings. Observing them in their grandparents' home would indeed provide a more accurate picture of their emotional state and developmental progress. Thomas knew he had to act quickly. An unfavorable assessment from Dr. Pemberton would provide Lady Vivienne with the ammunition she needed to convince Lord Edmund that the children's visits should be severely limited or ended altogether. Worse still, it might plant seeds of doubt in Lady Catherine's mind about her own parenting abilities, potentially causing lasting damage to the family relationships. That evening, Thomas made a decision that went against every instinct of professional discretion he had developed over 2 decades of service. He requested a private meeting with Mrs. Hartford, the head housekeeper, and Mr. Jameson, the butler who had served the family for 30 years. Both were individuals he trusted completely, and both had witnessed Lady Vivienne's treatment of the children firsthand. They met in Mrs. Hartford's sitting room after the family had retired for the evening. Thomas had never convened such a meeting before, and he could see the curiosity and concern in his colleagues' faces as he explained what he had overheard. "I've suspected something of this nature," Mrs. Hartford said quietly after Thomas finished his account. "Lady Vivienne has been asking pointed questions about the children's behavior, almost as if she were building a case against them." Mr. Jameson nodded gravely. "Just yesterday, she questioned me extensively about an incident where Master James accidentally knocked over a small vase in the morning room. It was clearly an accident. The child apologized immediately and offered to help clean up, but Lady Vivienne seemed to interpret it as evidence of careless, destructive behavior." "The children have changed since Lady Vivienne's arrival, Mrs. Pialot," Hartford continued. "They're more hesitant, more eager to please, constantly seeking reassurance. That's not the behavior of spoiled, undisciplined children. It's the behavior of children who are walking on eggshells." Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "Dr. Pemberton is scheduled to conduct an evaluation during the children's next visit. If he observes them while they're in this anxious, uncertain state, his assessment could be used to justify separating them from their grandfather permanently." "What do you propose we do?" Mr. Jameson asked. "We cannot directly contradict Lady Vivienne without risking our positions, and Lord Edmund clearly trusts his wife's judgment in domestic matters." Thomas had been considering this question for hours. "I believe we need to document the children's natural behavior when they're comfortable and confident, and we need to ensure that Dr. Pemberton has access to a complete picture of their character and capabilities." Over the next hour, the 3 long-serving staff members developed a careful plan. Mrs. Hartford would arrange for the children's next visit to include activities where they historically excelled and felt confident. Music lessons with the manor's piano, nature walks with the head gardener, and storytelling sessions in the library. Mr. Jameson would ensure that these positive interactions were subtly brought to Dr. Pemberton's attention during his visit, and Thomas would continue his documentation while being prepared to provide testimony about the children's true character if the situation became dire. The plan was implemented 3 days later when Lady Catherine arrived with Emma and James for what was supposed to be a week-long visit. Thomas could see the children's initial hesitation as they entered the manor, their earlier spontaneous joy replaced by careful politeness. But Mrs. Hartford's arrangements began to take effect almost immediately. Emma was invited to play the piano for the household staff's afternoon tea, a tradition that had been established during her grandmother's time. As her small fingers moved across the keys, playing a simple melody she had learned, her confidence began to return. The staff's genuine appreciation and applause brought a smile to her face that had been absent for weeks. James was taken to the garden by Mr. Patterson, the head gardener, to check on the robin's nest they had discovered. The little boy's natural curiosity reasserted itself as he observed the newly hatched chicks and asked thoughtful questions about their development. His excitement was infectious, drawing a crowd of staff members who were charmed by his enthusiasm and intelligence. Dr. Pemberton arrived on Thursday afternoon precisely as Lady Vivian had planned. Thomas positioned himself strategically to observe the evaluation, knowing that his testimony might be crucial if the assessment went poorly. The doctor's first interaction with the children was carefully orchestrated by Lady Vivienne. She brought him to the morning room where Emma was practicing her penmanship, a task that the little girl had never particularly enjoyed and that had become a source of anxiety since Lady Vivian's earlier criticism. "Emma, dear, this is Dr. Pemberton," Lady Vivian said, with false sweetness. "He's here to see how you're progressing with your studies." Emma looked up nervously, her small hand trembling slightly as she held her pen. "Good afternoon, Dr. Son Pemberton," she said quietly. The doctor examined her writing exercise with a critical eye. "Show me how you form your letters, young lady." Under the combined scrutiny of Dr. Pemberton and Lady Vivian, Emma's earlier anxiety returned in full force. Her usually neat penmanship became shaky and uncertain, and she began to make mistakes she wouldn't normally make. When Dr. Pemberton pointed out these errors, Emma's eyes filled with tears, exactly as Lady Vivian had predicted. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can usually do better." "Can you indeed?" Dr. Pemberton said skeptically. "Young ladies your age should be able to maintain composure during academic exercises. Emotional outbursts are not conducive to learning." Thomas watched this interaction with growing anger, but he forced himself to remain patient. Mrs. Hartford's plan was about to be put into motion. "Dr. Pemberton," Mrs. Hartford said, appearing in the doorway with perfect timing. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Cook has prepared tea in the music room, and she was hoping Miss Emma might honor us with a performance on the piano. It's become such a cherished tradition during the children's visits." Lady Vivian's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but she could hardly object to such a reasonable request without appearing deliberately obstructive. Of course, Emma enjoys playing for others. The transition to the music room provided exactly the change of environment the children needed. Emma's demeanor transformed as she sat at the beautiful grand piano that had belonged to her grandmother. Her small hands found the keys with confidence, and she began to play a piece she had been practicing, a gentle waltz that filled the room with sweet melody. Dr. Pemberton's expression began to soften as he watched and listened. This was not the behavior of an emotionally unstable child, but rather the performance of a young girl with natural musical talent and genuine passion for her art. "That was lovely, my dear," Dr. Pemberton said when Emma finished. "How long have you been playing?" "Mama started teaching me when I was 5, but grandfather has been helping me learn grandmother's favorite songs," Emma replied, her confidence returning as she spoke about something she loved. "Would you like to hear another one?" As Emma played a second piece, James was brought into the room by Mr. Sir Cole Patterson, who was eager to share the boy's latest nature observations. James had prepared a small journal of his bird-watching activities, complete with careful drawings and detailed notes about behavior he had observed. "Dr. Pemberton, you must hear Master James's account of the robin family, Mr. Bragman," Patterson said enthusiastically. "His observations have been quite remarkable for someone his age." James began to recount his experiences with the confidence of a child discussing his favorite subject. He spoke knowledgeably about bird behavior, nesting patterns, and the development of the chicks he had been watching. His vocabulary was sophisticated, his observations detailed, and his genuine enthusiasm evident. Dr. Pemberton listened with growing interest and approval. "These are very astute observations, young man. Have you been reading about birds in your spare time?"
Yes, sir.
"Grandfather has books about British birds in the library, and I've been studying the pictures to learn how to identify different species. I've seen 15 different kinds in the garden so far." Thomas could see Lady Vivian's frustration mounting as the children displayed behavior that directly contradicted her narrative of emotional instability and developmental delays. But she was far from defeated, and Thomas knew that she would find ways to undermine these positive demonstrations. The real test came that evening during dinner, when all the family members were gathered together in the formal dining room. Lady Vivian had clearly planned this as her opportunity to showcase the children's supposed inadequacies in a social setting.
"Children,"
she said sweetly as the soup course was being served, "Dr. Pemberton has been so interested in your progress. Why don't you tell him about your recent lessons at home?" The question was clearly designed to put the children on the spot, forcing them to perform under pressure in an adult social setting. Emma and James exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what was expected of them. But Lord Edmund, who had been delighted by the positive reports he had received about his grandchildren's day, intervened with his characteristic warmth and wisdom. "Actually, I think Dr. Pemberton has already had an excellent demonstration of their accomplishments," he said with a proud smile. "Hartford tells me Emma's piano performance was particularly beautiful today, and Mr. Patterson was quite impressed with James's knowledge of ornithology. I couldn't be more pleased with their progress." The support from their beloved grandfather gave both children the confidence they needed to navigate the remainder of the meal successfully. They answered Dr. Pemberton's questions thoughtfully, demonstrated proper table manners, and engaged in age-appropriate conversation without any of the emotional outbursts or concentration problems Lady Vivian had predicted. By the end of the evening, Thomas could see that Dr. Pemberton's initial concerns had been largely alleviated. The children had demonstrated normal, healthy behavior consistent with their ages and backgrounds. Any assessment he provided would likely be positive, undermining Lady Vivian's campaign to have them removed from the manor. But Thomas also knew that this victory was temporary. Lady Vivian was intelligent and determined, and she would undoubtedly develop new strategies for achieving her goals. The battle for the children's place at Ravenshollow Manor was far from over, and the next phase would likely be even more dangerous than what had come before. Dr. Pemberton's favorable assessment proved to be a significant setback for Lady Vivian's plans, but it also marked the beginning of a more dangerous phase in her campaign against the children. Thomas observed her growing frustration over the following days, noting how she became increasingly careless in her attempts to manipulate situations to her advantage. The turning point came exactly 1 week after Dr. Pemberton's visit, during what should have been a peaceful Sunday afternoon at Ravenshollow Manor. Lord Edmund had taken the children to the village church for morning service, a weekly tradition he had maintained since his own childhood. Lady Catherine had remained at the manor with a mild headache, resting in her old bedroom while Lady Vivian claimed to be occupied with correspondence in her private sitting room. Thomas was conducting his routine security rounds when he noticed that Lady Vivian's door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Her voice carried clearly into the hallway, and he realized she was speaking with Mrs. Blackwood in the same unguarded manner he had overheard weeks earlier. "The doctor's visit was a complete disaster," Lady Vivian was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "Those interfering servants clearly orchestrated the entire afternoon to make the children appear competent and well-adjusted. Perhaps we need to consider a more direct approach," Mrs. Garassi-Pose asked. Blackwood suggested quietly, "if subtle methods aren't working." "Oh, I have something far more direct in mind," Lady Vivian replied, her tone carrying a dangerous edge that Thomas had never heard before. "Catherine is vulnerable right now, struggling with motherhood, uncertain about her place in this family, desperate for approval and guidance. All it would take is the right kind of incident to convince her that bringing the children here is genuinely harmful to them." Thomas felt his blood run cold as he listened to this escalation in Lady Vivian's planning. Her previous manipulations had been psychological, designed to gradually erode confidence and create doubt, but now she seemed to be contemplating something more immediate and potentially more damaging. "What sort of incident?" Mrs. Blackwood asked nervously. "Nothing that would cause real harm, of course," Lady Vivian said with false reassurance. "But children have accidents all the time, especially when they're excited and not properly supervised. A fall downstairs, perhaps, or a mishap near the pond. Something that would frighten Catherine enough to make her question whether Ravenshollow is truly safe for her precious little ones." Thomas gripped the doorframe, struggling to maintain his composure as the full implications of Lady Vivian's words sank in. She was discussing deliberately arranging an accident that would injure one of the children as a way to manipulate their mother into keeping them away from the manor permanently. "Lady Vivian," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice wavering, "surely you don't mean to actually hurt the children?" Don't be naive, Eleanor. I'm talking about creating a situation that appears dangerous while ensuring the children aren't seriously injured. A tumble that results in a few tears and perhaps a small bruise. Nothing more. But it would be enough to terrorize Catherine and give me the leverage I need to suggest that perhaps the manor is too overwhelming an environment for such young, accident-prone children. Thomas had heard enough. This crossed every line of acceptable behavior and moved into territory that threatened the physical safety of innocent children. His role as head of security demanded immediate action to prevent harm, regardless of the political consequences within the household. But as he considered his options, Thomas realized that confronting Lady Vivian directly would likely result in denial and potentially alert her to his knowledge of her plans. Instead, he needed evidence and witnesses that could not be dismissed or explained away. He quietly retreated from the doorway and made his way to the servants' hall, where he found Mrs. Hartford overseeing the afternoon cleaning schedule. Without explanation, he asked her to accompany him on an urgent matter, leading her back toward Lady Vivian's sitting room. "Listen carefully," he whispered as they approached the door, which was still partially open. Lady Vivian was still speaking, her voice now carrying an excited energy as she elaborated on her plan. "The beauty of it is that everyone will assume it was simply an unfortunate accident. Children fall and bump into things constantly. No one will suspect it was arranged, and Catherine's maternal instincts will do the rest. She'll be so frightened and guilty about allowing harm to come to her children that she'll convince herself they're safer at their own estate." Mrs. Hartford's face went pale as she listened to this cold calculation. Her hands began to tremble with suppressed anger as Lady Vivian continued to outline her scheme. "When do you plan to implement this?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. "Soon. The children are becoming too comfortable here again, and Edmund is growing suspicious of my concerns about their behavior. I need to act while Catherine is still uncertain and vulnerable to suggestion." Thomas gently touched Mrs. Hartford's arm, signaling that they had heard enough. They retreated carefully, making their way to his office in the staff quarters where they could speak privately without risk of being overheard. "Dear God, Mrs. W.O.W.W. Hartford whispered, sinking into a chair. "She's planning to hurt those innocent babies to serve her own purposes. What manner of woman have we been serving?" Thomas paced the small room, his mind racing through possible courses of action. "We need to protect the children immediately, but we also need to ensure that Lord Edmund learns the truth about his wife's character. Simply warning him about a vague threat won't be enough. He loves her and trusts her, and Lady Vivian is skilled at presenting herself as caring and reasonable. What about Lady Catherine? Shouldn't she know that her children are in danger? Eventually, yes. But Catherine is exactly as vulnerable as Lady Vivian described. Uncertain, seeking approval, easily manipulated by authority figures. If we approach her with accusations against her father's wife, she might not believe us, or she might confront Lady Vivian directly and warn her that we know about her plans." Mrs. Hartford nodded slowly, understanding the delicate politics of the situation. "So what do we do?" Thomas had been formulating a plan as they spoke. "We need to catch Lady Vivian in the act of implementing her scheme, but we need to do it in a way that protects the children from actual harm while providing undeniable proof of her intentions." They spent the next hour developing a strategy that would require careful timing and coordination among the trusted staff members. Thomas would increase his surveillance of Lady Vivian's movements, looking for signs that she was preparing to act on her threats. Mrs. Cabadohi, Hartford would ensure that the children were never left unsupervised in potentially dangerous situations, using household duties as excuses to maintain constant adult presence around them. Most importantly, they would need to be prepared to document and witness any attempt Lady Vivian made to create the accident she had described. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The very next day, Monday afternoon, Thomas observed Lady Vivian watching the children play in the garden with unusual intensity. Emma and James were engaged in one of their favorite activities, feeding the ducks at the small ornamental pond that graced the manor's east lawn. The pond was shallow and relatively safe, but it was surrounded by decorative stones that could cause injury if a child fell. Lady Catherine was inside the manor speaking with the cook about dinner arrangements. Lord Edmund was in his study, meeting with his estate manager about some business matters. The children were technically supervised by one of the younger maids, But the girl was easily distracted and often wandered away from her charges when they seemed safely occupied. Thomas positioned himself with a clear view of the garden while maintaining the appearance of conducting routine security duties. He had also quietly alerted Mr. Jameson and Mr. Patterson, the head gardener, to keep watch from their respective positions. Lady Vivian approached the children with her usual false sweetness, carrying a large bag of bread crusts. "Emma, James, would you like some extra bread for the ducks? I thought they might enjoy a special treat." Both children accepted the offering eagerly, delighted by what seemed like kindness from their step-grandmother. Thomas watched as Lady Vivian positioned herself near the decorative stone border of the pond, seemingly to get a better view of the feeding activity. What happened next unfolded exactly as Thomas had feared. As James leaned over the water's edge to toss bread to the ducks, Lady Vivian subtly shifted her position, creating what appeared to be an accidental obstacle with her skirt. When James stepped backward, still focused on the ducks, he caught his foot in the fabric and began to lose his balance toward the stone edging. But Thomas was ready. He had positioned himself for exactly this possibility, and he moved with the speed and precision that 20 years of security training had developed. He reached James before the child could fall, catching him securely and preventing any contact with the dangerous stones. "Careful there, young master," Thomas said loudly enough for Lady Vivian to hear clearly. "These stones can be quite treacherous when they're wet." Lady Vivian's expression of concern appeared genuine to casual observation, but Thomas could see the flash of frustration in her eyes as her plan was thwarted. "Oh my goodness," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "James, you gave me such a fright. Thank heavens Thomas was there to catch you." But Mr. Patterson had also witnessed the incident from his position near the rose garden, and his trained eye had caught what others might miss: the deliberate positioning, the calculated timing, the way Lady Vivian had created the hazard that nearly caused James to fall. Thomas helped James steady himself and guided both children away from the pond's edge. "Perhaps we should continue feeding the ducks from the safer side of the garden," he suggested. "There's less chance of anyone slipping on wet stones over there." As they moved away, Thomas caught Mr. Patterson's eye and saw the older man's grim nod of understanding. They now had 2 witnesses to Lady Vivian's attempt to orchestrate an accident, but they still needed to determine the best way to present this information to Lord Edmund without allowing Lady Vivian to escape consequences through denial or manipulation. That evening, after the children had been safely delivered back to their mother and the family had retired for the night, Thomas convened another meeting with Mrs. Hartford and Mr. Jameson. This time, he also included Mr. Patterson, whose testimony about the pond incident would be crucial. "We can no longer delay," Thomas said firmly. "Lady Vivian has moved from psychological manipulation to physical endangerment. If we don't act now, one of those children will be seriously hurt the next time she attempts this kind of scheme." Mrs. Hartford nodded gravely. "But how do we approach Lord Edmund? He's completely besotted with her, and she'll claim it was all an unfortunate misunderstanding." Thomas had been considering this problem all evening. "We need to present him with the complete picture, not just today's incident, but the pattern of behavior we've all witnessed over recent months. And we need to do it in a way that demonstrates our loyalty to the family, rather than appearing like we're simply causing trouble for his wife." The 4 long-serving staff members spent the next 2 hours planning their approach. They would request a private meeting with Lord Edmund, presenting their concerns as a security matter that required his immediate attention. Thomas would lead the discussion backed by the testimony of the other 3 witnesses. They would not demand that Lady Vivian be banished or punished. That decision would be Lord Edmund's to make. But they would ensure that he had all the information necessary to protect his grandchildren from further harm and to understand the true character of the woman he had married. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, and Thomas spent the rest of the night preparing for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his career. The safety and well-being of 2 innocent children hung in the balance, and he was determined not to fail them. Tuesday morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Thomas's somber mood as he prepared for the most crucial meeting of his career. At precisely 9 o'clock, he stood outside Lord Edmund's private study with Mrs. Hartford, Mr. Jameson, and Mr. Patterson, each of them carrying the weight of what they were about to reveal. Lord Edmund looked up from his morning correspondence with surprise when his butler announced the unusual delegation of senior staff members requesting an urgent audience. "Come in, all of you," he said, setting aside his papers. "This is certainly unprecedented. What brings you here together?" Thomas stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture he had maintained throughout his years of service. "My lord, we come to you with information that concerns the safety and well-being of your family, particularly your grandchildren. What we have to share is difficult, but we believe it is our duty to bring these matters to your attention." Lord Edmund's expression grew serious as he gestured for them to continue. "I'm listening, Thomas. Please proceed." Over the next 30 minutes, Thomas methodically presented the evidence they had gathered over the past several weeks. He began with Lady Vivian's overheard conversation about wanting to remove the children from the manor, then detailed the pattern of psychological manipulation they had observed. Mrs. Hartford provided specific examples of Lady Vivian's cruel comments to the children, while Mr. Jameson described her attempts to build a false narrative about their behavior for Dr. Copatrio. Pemberton. When Thomas reached the account of the pond incident and Lady Vivian's discussion of deliberately arranging an accident, Lord Edmund's face grew increasingly pale. Mr. Patterson's testimony about witnessing the calculated nature of the near fall provided the final damning piece of evidence. Lord Edmund sat in stunned silence for several long moments after they finished speaking. Thomas could see the struggle playing out across the older man's features. The conflict between love for his wife and the undeniable evidence of her calculated cruelty toward his beloved grandchildren. "These are very serious accusations," Lord Edmund said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had heard. "You're suggesting that my wife has been systematically undermining my relationship with Emma and James, and that she deliberately attempted to cause physical harm to my grandson." "We are, my lord," Thomas replied without hesitation, "and we stand ready to swear to the truth of everything we have told you. None of us takes pleasure in bringing such news, but we could not stand by and watch innocent children be harmed." Lord Edmund rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the garden where his grandchildren had played so happily just the day before. "I need to hear this from Vivian herself," he said quietly. "If what you say is true, she will have to answer for her actions. But I must give her the opportunity to defend herself." Thomas had expected this response. "Of course, my lord. We would ask only that you consider the children's safety in any conversation you have with Lady Vivian. If she realizes the extent of our knowledge, she may become desperate and potentially more dangerous. You believe she would actually harm Emma and James?" "I believe she would do whatever she felt necessary to achieve her goals," Thomas replied carefully. "Yesterday's incident suggests she has already crossed the line from psychological manipulation to physical endangerment." Lord Edmund nodded slowly. "Very well. I want you all to continue your duties as normal while I decide how to handle this situation. And Thomas, I want additional security measures put in place immediately. No one is to be alone with my grandchildren except their parents and grandfather until this matter is resolved." The 4 staff members filed out of the study, leaving Lord Edmund alone with the devastating knowledge of his wife's true character. Thomas knew that the coming hours would be among the most difficult in the older man's life, but he felt relief that the children would finally be protected from further harm. Lady Vivian's reaction to the increased security measures provided immediate confirmation of her guilt. When she discovered that a staff member was now constantly present whenever she was in the same room as the children, her facade of concern began to crack noticeably. "This is ridiculous, Edmund," she complained that afternoon as they walked in the garden with Emma and James under Thomas's watchful supervision. "One would think the children were visiting royalty rather than simply spending time with their grandparents. Why is security hovering over us constantly?" Lord Edmund's response was measured but telling. "I've become concerned about potential safety hazards around the estate, my dear. Thomas identified several areas where accidents might occur, and I want to ensure our grandchildren are properly protected." Thomas saw Lady Vivian's eyes narrow slightly at this explanation. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her husband's sudden concern about safety might be connected to yesterday's pond incident, but she couldn't be certain how much he knew without revealing her own involvement. The confrontation Thomas had been expecting came that evening after the children had been taken home by their mother. Lady Vivian cornered Thomas in the servants' corridor as he completed his final security rounds of the day. "I want to know exactly what you think you're doing," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Your sudden hovering around the children, your whispered conversations with the other staff, Your mysterious reports to my husband about safety concerns. What game are you playing, Thomas? Thomas faced her calmly, drawing on decades of training in maintaining composure under pressure. I'm not playing any games, Lady Vivienne. I'm simply doing my job, which is to ensure the safety and security of this household and everyone in it. Don't treat me like a fool, she snapped. I know you've been watching me, listening to private conversations, interfering with my relationship with the children. You've overstepped your position badly, and I won't tolerate it. My position requires me to be observant about potential threats to the family's well-being, Thomas replied evenly. If you feel that my diligence in protecting the children constitutes overstepping, perhaps you should discuss that concern with Lord Edmund. Lady Vivienne's face flushed with anger, but she seemed to recognize that threatening a senior staff member, who clearly had her husband's confidence, would be counterproductive. This conversation is not over, she said before turning and striding away. But Thomas knew that it was over, at least in terms of Lady Vivienne's ability to harm the children. Lord Edmund's decision came the following morning, delivered in the same study where the revelations had been shared just 2 days earlier. I spent most of yesterday evening in conversation with my wife, Lord Edmund said, his voice reflecting the emotional toll of those discussions. I presented her with the concerns that were brought to my attention, and I'm afraid her responses confirmed the validity of your observations. Thomas maintained his professional composure, but he felt a surge of relief that Lady Vivienne had not been able to manipulate her way out of the situation. Vivienne will be leaving Ravenshollow Manor permanently, Lord Edmund continued. I have arranged for her to return to her family estate in Scotland, where she will remain. Our marriage is effectively ended, though the legal formalities will take some time to complete. I'm sorry for your loss, my lord, Thomas said sincerely. He knew that despite everything, this decision represented the end of Lord Edmund's hopes for companionship and happiness in his later years. Thank you, Thomas. Your loyalty to this family, and particularly to my grandchildren, will not be forgotten. I failed to protect them from someone they should have been able to trust, and I'm grateful that you and the staff were watching over them when I was not. The transformation of Ravenshollow Manor over the following weeks was remarkable. With Lady Vivienne's oppressive presence removed, the house seemed to breathe again. Emma and James returned to their confident, joyful selves almost immediately, their laughter once again echoing through the corridors as it had during their grandmother Margaret's time. Lady Catherine, freed from the constant undermining of her confidence as a mother, blossomed in her interactions with her children. The anxiety and uncertainty that had plagued her during Lady Vivienne's residence gradually faded, replaced by the natural warmth and assurance that had characterized her before her father's remarriage. Lord Edmund, though saddened by the dissolution of his second marriage, found genuine contentment in his restored relationships with his daughter and grandchildren. The house filled with guests again, family friends, distant relatives, and neighbors who had stayed away during Lady Vivienne's reign but now felt welcome to return. Thomas resumed his regular security duties, but with a deeper understanding of his role in protecting the family. He had learned that threats could come from within as well as without, and that sometimes the greatest service he could provide was not physical protection but moral courage in the face of injustice. 3 months after Lady Vivienne's departure, Thomas received an unexpected visit from Doc Pemberton, who had heard rumors about the dramatic changes at Ravenshollow Manor. The elderly physician was eager to understand what had transpired, particularly regarding his assessment of the children. I must admit, Thomas, I was troubled by some inconsistencies I observed during my evaluation, Dr. Pemberton confided as they walked through the restored gardens. The children I examined in private moments with Lady Vivienne seemed anxious and uncertain, but the same children displayed remarkable confidence and ability when they were comfortable and supported. It suggested to me that external factors were influencing their behavior. You were quite perceptive, Doctor, Thomas replied. The children are thriving now that those external pressures have been removed. Dr. Chenra speaking followers in the accenting village.
Pemberton nodded thoughtfully. It's a reminder that we must always consider the environment when evaluating a child's development.
What appears to be a personal failing may actually be a natural response to an unhealthy situation. As they completed their walk, Thomas reflected on the lessons of the past months. He had begun this ordeal simply trying to protect 2 innocent children from psychological manipulation, but in the end, he had helped preserve the integrity of an entire family. The quiet response he had chosen, careful observation, strategic intervention, and ultimately courageous testimony, had indeed altered the course of life at Ravenshollow Manor forever. Emma and James would grow up knowing they were loved and valued by their grandfather, supported by their mother, and protected by those who served their family with genuine devotion. The cruelty and manipulation they had briefly experienced would become merely a distant memory, overshadowed by years of warmth, security, and unconditional love. And Thomas would continue his service to the Pemberton family, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or force, but with quiet determination and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The ancient stones of Ravenshollow Manor had witnessed many dramas over the centuries, but few as significant as the quiet revolution that had restored light and laughter to its halls. In the end, it was not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations that had saved the day, but the steady courage of ordinary people who refused to stand by while innocence was under assault. As Thomas made his evening rounds that night, he paused in the main hallway where he had first overheard Lady Vivian's cruel words about the children. The corridor was quiet now, but it was the peaceful quiet of a home at rest, not the oppressive silence of a house under siege. Tomorrow would bring Emma and James back for another visit with their grandfather, and their joyful voices would once again fill these ancient walls with the sound of childhood happiness. The guard's quiet response had indeed altered the palace forever, proving that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost.